Part 5, Graduation, Chapter 13, Ending the Victim Narrative. Why blaming the Matrix keeps consciousness contracted. One of the most difficult transitions in spiritual development occurs when consciousness begins to recognize that the conditions of its experience may not be random, yet still wants to identify something outside itself as the cause of its limitation. The Matrix becomes an attractive explanation. The system is responsible. The archons are responsible. Society is responsible. Karma is responsible. The simulation is responsible. The world is responsible. There is something outside oneself that is preventing freedom, withholding knowledge, manipulating circumstances, or deliberately keeping consciousness asleep. These interpretations can provide a powerful sense of coherence. They transform suffering from something apparently meaningless into something that has an identifiable cause. Yet they can also create a subtle inversion of the very spiritual movement they appear to support. The individual who believes they are trapped by an external system may become increasingly preoccupied with the system. The prison becomes the center of attention. The jailer becomes the object of meditation. The mechanisms of limitation become more interesting than the consciousness experiencing them. And in that movement, consciousness can remain psychologically and spiritually oriented toward the very structure it wishes to transcend. This is one reason the victim narrative is so difficult to escape. It does not necessarily present itself as weakness. It can present itself as awakening. To recognize that something is wrong with reality may initially feel like liberation. To discover hidden structures, unseen forces, karmic mechanisms, or subtle forms of administration can produce the sensation of seeing behind the curtain. But seeing a structure does not necessarily mean transcending it. One can become extraordinarily knowledgeable about the prison while remaining psychologically identified with being a prisoner. The deeper question is therefore not simply, who is responsible for my limitation? It is, what is my present relationship with limitation? That question changes everything. If reality is understood as a lawful curriculum, then limitation is no longer evidence that existence has turned against consciousness. It becomes information about the conditions under which consciousness is presently capable of operating. A human being does not begin incarnation with unlimited perception. They possess a particular body, nervous system, temperament, family, culture, historical period, genetic inheritance, psychological structure, and karmic configuration. These conditions form the initial boundaries of the curriculum. The presence of boundaries does not automatically imply oppression. A lesson has boundaries because without boundaries, there is no meaningful lesson. A musical instrument cannot produce every sound simultaneously. A mathematical problem cannot be solved without constraints. A physical body cannot experience every environment at once. Limitation creates specificity. Specificity creates experience. Experience creates interaction. Interaction creates learning. And learning changes the structure through which future experience becomes possible. Seen in this way, the question shifts from escaping the matrix to understanding the mechanism through which consciousness participates in it. This does not require denying the existence of external forces. There may indeed be structures, intelligences, karmic administrators, environmental influences, or subtle beings operating beyond ordinary perception. The important distinction is that their existence does not automatically make them enemies. An administrator can restrict access without being malicious. A karmic structure can prevent an experience without being punitive. A boundary can prevent premature expansion without being imprisonment. The spiritual task is therefore not to replace one unquestioned story with another. It is to examine the function of the structure. What does the limitation produce? What does it prevent? What does it reveal? What capacity is being developed through it? What pattern repeatedly appears? What changes when consciousness changes? These questions return attention from the alleged jailer to the actual curriculum, and that is where liberation begins. Radical responsibility within lawful reality. Radical responsibility does not mean believing that an individual consciously creates every event that occurs in their life. It does not mean that every illness, accident, betrayal, loss, injustice, or tragedy was consciously chosen. nor does it require the simplistic belief that everything happens because a person somehow manifested it. That interpretation merely replaces one form of blame with another. Within the framework of this book, responsibility means something more precise. It means recognizing that whatever the origin of an experience, consciousness is responsible for its relationship to that experience. Reality presents conditions, consciousness encounters them. The response emerges according to present capacity, and the response itself becomes part of the continuing development of consciousness. This distinction is essential. A person may not have chosen the family into which they were born. They may not have chosen their biological constitution. They may not have chosen their historical era. They may not have chosen the limitations of their early environment. They may not have chosen every circumstance that later entered their life. But once an experience is present, consciousness enters into relationship with it. That relationship becomes meaningful. This is where responsibility begins. Responsibility is therefore not necessarily authorship, it is participation. The distinction liberates the individual from two opposite errors. The first is helplessness. Nothing is my responsibility because everything is being done to me. The second is excessive self-blame. Everything that happens is my fault because I created everything. Neither is necessary. A lawful universe requires neither helplessness nor narcissistic omnipotence. Consciousness can participate without being the sole author. This is particularly important when considering karma. If karma is correspondence rather than punishment, then karmic experience does not require a cosmic judge assigning suffering according to moral worth. Instead, consciousness encounters conditions compatible with its existing structure. The result is not necessarily comfortable. Growth rarely depends upon comfort alone. A pattern may continue because the consciousness participating in it has not yet developed the capacity required to move beyond it. The same circumstance may therefore be experienced very differently by different individuals. One person encounters rejection, collapses into identification. Another encounters rejection and develops discernment. Another becomes compassionate. Another becomes detached. Another becomes bitter. The external event does not completely determine the internal result. The existing structure of consciousness mediates the encounter. This is the mechanics of responsibility. The world supplies circumstances. Consciousness supplies its present mode of participation. Neither side can simply be removed from the equation. Radical responsibility therefore means becoming increasingly conscious of one's participation in the process. Instead of asking only, why is this happening to me? The question becomes, what is this experience revealing about the structure through which I am encountering reality? Instead of, who is doing this to me? The inquiry becomes, what pattern is being exposed? Instead of, how do I escape this? The question becomes, what would have to change within consciousness for this experience to be understood differently or no longer reproduced? These are not merely changes in language. They represent a movement in the location of attention. Attention moves from accusation toward observation. Observation creates understanding. Understanding creates capacity. Capacity creates new possibilities. This is why responsibility is liberating. It returns the individual to the one domain in which development can actually occur, the structure of consciousness itself. Reclaiming agency without requiring absolute free will. If consciousness unfolds according to lawful conditions, does agency disappear? Not necessarily. What disappears is the requirement that agency must mean absolute independence from causation. The ordinary concept of free will often assumes that a person could have chosen otherwise, under precisely the same conditions, with precisely the same knowledge, precisely the same psychological structure, and precisely the same state of consciousness. But if the previous chapters are correct, this is difficult to establish. At every moment, action emerges from the configuration that exists at that moment. The body has a particular condition. The mind has accumulated particular impressions. The senses have received particular information. Memory contains particular experiences. Desires possess particular intensities. Fear has particular associations. Understanding has reached a particular degree. Awareness has access to some possibilities and not others. Action emerges from the whole configuration. This does not make action meaningless. It makes agency more subtle. Agency can be understood as the capacity of consciousness to participate in its own transformation. The individual may not possess absolute freedom at the beginning of a process, but consciousness can acquire greater freedom as understanding expands. This produces a paradox. Freedom is not necessarily the absence of conditioning. Freedom may be the progressive reduction of unconscious conditioning. A person dominated by an impulse may experience the impulse as a command. A person who recognizes the impulse as an arising phenomenon has already created a different relationship with it. A person who understands its origin may gain another degree of freedom. A person who integrates the underlying lesson may no longer generate the same impulse with the same intensity. The structure has changed. The range of possible responses has expanded. This is genuine development even if the process itself remains lawful. The seed does not choose to become a tree in the conventional sense, yet the tree unfolds through a lawful developmental process. Human consciousness may function in a comparable manner. The organism develops. The mind develops, perception develops, discernment develops, awareness develops. As the structure changes, the possibilities available to consciousness change with it. This allows agency to be understood developmentally rather than absolutely. At one stage, a person may be incapable of seeing an alternative. At another, the alternative becomes visible. At another, it becomes accessible. At another, it becomes natural. What previously required enormous effort eventually requires almost none. The person may look backward and say, I could have chosen differently. But the more precise observation is, I can choose differently now because I am no longer the consciousness that encountered that moment. This is the retrospective illusion. The present self looks backward using capacities acquired later and projects those capacities onto the earlier self. But the earlier configuration did not possess the later configuration. The difference matters. It means that liberation does not require proving that one possessed unlimited free will all along. It requires developing the capacity that makes greater freedom possible now. This is a much more practical form of agency. One does not need to control the entire universe. One needs to become increasingly conscious of the mechanism through which one participates in it. The deeper freedom is therefore not, I can do absolutely anything. It is, I increasingly understand why I do, what governs my responses, and what must change for a different response to become possible. That is agency without metaphysical fantasy. It is responsibility without self-condemnation. It is freedom without requiring freedom from law. And perhaps most importantly, it is compatible with the idea that the entire developmental process itself unfolds according to a larger order. Moving from resistance to understanding. Resistance is often the first response to limitation. Something hurts, something blocks us, something does not conform to expectation. Consciousness pushes against it. This is natural. Resistance can even be useful. It reveals where attachment exists. It reveals where expectation conflicts with reality. It reveals where the present structure of consciousness is unable to accommodate what is occurring. But resistance becomes a problem when it becomes an identity. The individual begins defining existence through opposition. Reality is wrong. The system is wrong. The body is wrong. The circumstances are wrong. The archons are wrong. Karma is wrong. Everyone else is asleep. The awakened individual becomes the one who knows that reality is fundamentally broken. This is still identification. The polarity has simply changed. Instead of identifying with the conventional world, consciousness identifies with opposition to the conventional world. The prison has been rejected intellectually while remaining psychologically central. Understanding offers another route. Understanding does not mean approving of everything. It does not mean tolerating cruelty. It does not mean abandoning discernment. It does not mean pretending that harmful behavior is beneficial. And it certainly does not mean refusing to act when action is required. Understanding simply asks a different question. What is actually happening here? Without the immediate requirement to condemn it, without the immediate requirement to worship it, without the immediate requirement to escape it. Observe, understand. Then respond according to the highest capacity presently available. This is remarkably close to the spirit of Dharma. Dharma is not passive acceptance of whatever occurs. It is appropriate participation in the order of reality. Sometimes Dharma means remaining still. Sometimes it means walking away. Sometimes it means speaking. Sometimes it means refusing. Sometimes it means enduring. Sometimes it means acting decisively. The difference lies in whether action emerges from understanding or unconscious reaction. Resistance says, reality must change before I can be at peace. Understanding says, let me understand reality clearly enough to know what action is appropriate. Resistance asks, how do I defeat the structure? Understanding asks, what is the function of the structure? Resistance sees limitation and concludes, I am being prevented. Understanding sees limitation and asks, what capacity has not yet developed? This does not make every limitation desirable. It makes limitation intelligible, and intelligibility is enormously powerful. Once a pattern becomes understood, consciousness no longer needs to fight the pattern blindly. It can work with it. A person who understands their recurring karmic pattern does not need to spend their entire life asking why the universe keeps attacking them. They can begin examining the correspondence. What repeatedly attracts this experience? What perception accompanies it? What expectation precedes it? What reaction sustains it? What understanding is missing? What changes when the response changes? This is the movement from victimhood toward participation. It is also the beginning of graduation. Graduation does not mean escaping the universe. It means no longer requiring the same lesson in the same form. A student does not graduate because the school was evil. The student graduates because the curriculum has been integrated. Likewise, consciousness does not necessarily transcend a limitation by defeating the force that imposed it. It may transcend the limitation because the condition that made the limitation necessary has changed. This is one of the central propositions of the entire framework. Restrictions dissolve when their function is complete. The boundary does not have to be destroyed. The consciousness simply grows beyond the capacity that required the boundary. This is why the final movement is not war against the archons. It is understanding, not surrender to oppression, not blind acceptance, not passive resignation. Understanding. The more completely consciousness understands the lawful architecture through which experience unfolds, the less energy is consumed by resistance to the architecture itself. Attention becomes available for development. Development becomes integration. Integration becomes expansion. And expansion changes the relationship between consciousness and limitation. What once appeared to be a prison is recognized as a boundary. What appeared to be punishment is recognized as correspondence. What appeared to be obstruction is recognized as feedback. What appeared to be an enemy becomes part of the architecture through which consciousness learned to see. The final liberation is therefore not merely the discovery that there was no prison. It is the realization that the consciousness capable of calling reality a prison was itself still learning how to understand the curriculum. And once that understanding deepens sufficiently, the question changes one final time. Not, how do I escape this reality? But, what is reality teaching consciousness through this experience? That question opens the door to graduation.